Okay, so good afternoon and welcome to the penultimate new book seminar, which is being held by the Department of Media, Communications, Creative Arts, Language and Literature at Macquarie Uni. Our usual host, Bridget, is not able to make it this afternoon, so she's asked me to take over hosting duties, which I was very enthusiastic about doing. Before we get started, I just wanted to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which Macquarie University stands. So that's the Watermadigal clan of the Darug Nation. So their culture continues to nurture the land and the community where Macquarie stands. And I want to acknowledge elders past and present, and note that this land has never been ceded, always was and always will be Darug country. Okay, I'll just flip ahead so we can see that great book cover. So I think we're really lucky to have Joseph speaking to us this afternoon about his award-winning book, Biopolitics of the More Than Human, Forensic Ecologies of Violence. This is a theoretically heavy and quite dense book. It's a book that takes us to war zones, to borders, to the occupied Palestinian territories, and draws out really important connections to the ongoing settler colonial project that is Australia as well. And all the while, I think Joseph engages in this politics of visibility, bringing to light the entanglements of humans and non-human, more than humans, in these different sites where Joseph engages in this forensic analysis. And who better to bring into conversation than Ian Collinson, whose work also focuses on ecology and environmentality as well. I'm going to stop my share and I'll hand it over to you, Joseph and Ian.
Thank you, Ty. Thank you for your really warm welcome and also for the acknowledgement to country. And before I hand it over to Ian, I would like to underscore that acknowledgement and to say two things. I mean, if you've read the book, you know that for me, it's an ongoing project of unlearning a really virulent and destructive, what I call a Euro-anthropocentrism. And I qualify it as Eurocentric and attach it to the larger concept of anthropocentrism, because I've drawn on indigenous knowledges, what Viveris de Castro calls cosmopolitics, in order to mark the larger unified vision of what constitutes indigenous cosmologies and epistemologies, as a way of beginning to unlearn that Euro-anthropocentrism. And I've got to say, I'm not sure if Dr. Joe Ray is here, but I'm at the moment, I'm having an ongoing dialogue with a privileged dialogue with Dr. Ray, who is of the Darug Nation, and the book was written simultaneously, if you like, across Gadigal country, the Gadigal land of the Eora Nation and the Darug Nation, and so the issue of Indigenous acknowledgement of country, but moreover the issue of acknowledging Indigenous worldviews is really, for me, what are going to save the planet is really crucial in terms of the book. So thanks for that, Ty. Ian, it's over to you.
Oh, thanks, Joseph. Yes, Joseph and I spoke about this last week, and we said that we'd try and keep it informal. I suppose we'll follow the format that has been running. We might start with perhaps just the two of us for a while, and then at some point throw it open to questions. But I suppose if anyone has a question while Joseph and I are sort of talking at the beginning, then you can just put the question in the chat, and then I'll ask, or you can hold on to the chat. You can hold on to the chat. Hold on to your question until you have the later opportunity to contribute it. The point in the end, we just want to try and get people talking about this book, because I think people should. I've obviously read it, and I must admit, following on from Ty, I found it doubly difficult. One, in terms of the theoretical demands of the book, because it is a test, and it's a test because of the range of thinking it combines. We'll come back to this in a minute, I think. But also the sheer power, the visceral power of the testimonies or anecdotes or examples that it gives. And I felt there were moments when I was reading the book where I sort of read something, and I felt two things. One, that incredibly naive, that I didn't know that this particular thing had happened or was happening. But also the sheer power of the testimony. And I suppose that's because in the end, Joseph, many of the examples that you provide in line with this forensic ecology idea, they are testimonies to crimes. Yeah. What I was reading about was they weren't cultural examples. They were transcripts of crime scenes. So I felt that I should be shocked. And if I'm not shocked, there is really something wrong with me if I don't find this particular testimony shocking. And can I start with a bit of reading, Joseph? Is it okay for me to read a bit? Because just for people who haven't yet read it, and this is it actually starts on the first page of the introduction. As I said, I have read more of this book than the introduction, but this first bit, I'm just going to read. Bits of this are testimony from Atif Abu Saif, who's a citizen of Gaza, but it'll be mixed in with Joseph's prose as well. So to give you an idea of how it feels to read the book. In the fraught context of the relentless military assault, he, that Saif, repeatedly negotiated the wreckage of his bombed neighborhood to put on public record the enormity of the devastation wreaked by the Israeli Defense Forces. In one account, Saif describes the corpses of donkeys killed by the IDF strikes. And this is him now. Half a dozen lie in the road in front of the school. Their stomachs and intestines hang from their bellies. The seventh donkey is still alive, though critically injured. And then we return to Joseph. As he walks away from the site of this killing, he encounters a tree that is also a victim of the strike. And he's quoting, "The fig tree in front of the home is painted white with dust. Branches lie on the ground with fruit still on them." Then, back to Joseph again. Entering one of the bombed homes of his neighborhood, he is confronted by, and we're back to Saif, one boy who is still hysterical after seeing the flesh of his father and uncle mixed together like meat in a butcher's shop. Saif's testimony encapsulates the concerns of this book. And the book starts as it means to go on, and that I found myself continually confronted on almost every page of this book. So yeah, it's quite hard to put into words how it made me feel. I mean, the theory was the theoretical demands on the one hand, and the sheer viscerality of such passages on the other combine to make it incredibly, incredibly powerful. And we'll perhaps come back to some of the moments in the text later. So Joseph, just to start off with, what was the catalyst for this book? What drove you to write it? Because it feels like a book that needed to be written.
Yeah, look, thank you, Ian. And I guess we can start from the start, as you did, with the opening lines of the book. And I had recently finished, it was 2014, June. I can answer your question in a sort of dated, located way. I had finished the state violence book, where I had looked at the way in which various states, again, the settler state in particular, uses what Michel Foucault would call the biopolitical caesura, and that is that split that basically distinguishes between what constitutes the human and the other than human, and whatever is constituted by that split as other than human then becomes available, if you like, for extermination with impunity, for torture with impunity, because they are seen as non-human subjects. So I looked at that context in the state violence book, in the context of Guantanamo, the so-called CIA black sites in Afghanistan, in Iraq, etc. And then I'd finished that book, and that was sort of hanging over me. And in June 2014, the Israeli Defense Forces launched Operation Protective Edge, which was really both a bombing and then a ground force invasion into Gaza, which lasted for over a month. And as I was following that on, particularly on social media, I began to see these testimonies coming out saying, well, my apiary has just been crushed by an IDF, Israeli Defense bulldozer. The chicken coop was also crushed by a bulldozer. An orchard was machine gunned by the IDF. Wells were poisoned. Sheep and donkeys were machine gunned. And I thought, well, hang on a minute. I mean, how does this fit then within this larger scheme of making the non-human other available to be killed with absolute impunity? And how can they fall outside of a legal frame? How can we begin to index these lives, these entities, which are more than human, but which are in inextricable relation with humans? I'm absolutely categorical about that. I refuse to sort of have this line of interdiction between humans and other than humans, because I view them precisely as in an ensemble, an ecology of relationality. And relationality in affective sense. I mean, if you read those testimonies like Ian did, there's such a profound sense of love, affection, and then loss, grief, and mourning and trauma when the donkeys get killed or the sheep die from thirst because the wells have been poisoned. And so I really wanted to begin to capture that these are crimes, as Ian said, and to index them as crimes. And even though the forensic lens was problematic for me, it was one way of beginning to mark the fact that what has transpired in these sites of military violence are crimes, even though they fall outside the rubric of standard Euro-anthropocentric law, whether it be international law or nation-state law, because Western models of Euro-anthropocentric law have, as I discuss in the book, supplied the infrastructure for international law, international environmental law, the international laws of war, humanitarian law, etc. So the need really for the book emerged out of trying to come to terms with the enormity of the violence against more than humans and humans, but also to account for them as crime scenes and to call for some sort of legal framework to begin to do justice to those crimes.
Certainly, and that's so nice leading into, I suppose, to the next one. So perhaps for people who aren't familiar with this, obviously the term forensic ecology is fundamental. Perhaps you could, for people who aren't familiar, which included me before I read your book, what do you mean by a forensic ecology?
Sure. Well, look, there are two parts there. Forensics really dates back to Roman times, where in the Roman Senate, they would produce particular objects which was said to present testimony to the Senate. And so they were evidentiary material. And of course, in the 19th century, this developed into a scientific practice. And I sort of tracked the genealogy of forensics. And most disturbingly, forensics, when I look at forensic pathology, which looks at, post-mortem examinations of bodies, say for a coronial inquest, a lot of the knowledge that we have about post-mortems were actually produced on the bodies of Black slaves and Indigenous people. There was grave robbing both in the United States and the US. So throughout the book, I try and show how really prestigious and really important scientific disciplines like forensics are actually deeply implicated within histories of empire and settler colonialism. The other thing about forensics is that I try to problematize is that in the Western sense, what forensics does is it places all the onus on the pathologist or the forensic expert, whether they be a ballistic expert that looks at bullet casings or a blood splatter expert. And they are the ones that, in Western terms, bring the mute testimony, and that's the actual, I'm quoting from a forensics textbook here, the mute testimony of a forensic object to speech. And I juxtapose that with Indigenous views where the objects are already speaking. I'm looking at Aboriginal Australian use in particular because we've got a long history of Aboriginal trackers being used by the settler state in order to find people who've been lost or to find corpses of people who have been who died in the desert, etc. And their approach is you actually have to listen to what the object says because the object's already speaking. So there's this notion that the so-called inanimate object is already invested with animation, with its own epistemologies, if you like, and it's a question of listening to what they have to say to you. That's the Indigenous view, in contradistinction to the Western forensics. And I sort of problematize Western forensics too, because, I mean, if you're looking at this notion that the forensic object is, in the sciences language, an expert witness, that's how it's framed. Well, there's a form of animism there going on. And it's like, it's by sleight of hand. So, what I'm trying to do is problematize the way in which Western forensics is actually founded on a disavowed animism, whereas Indigenous cosmologies avow their animism and say they establish an ethical relationship with the speaking object. So for me, the forensic frame was important, one, because it carries an ethico-legal weight to it. So instead of saying, how can we account for this? If for a non-human object or a more than human object that's a victim of a crime, the only way we can do that is to place it within a legal frame. And the only way we can do that when it's an entity that's been, say, killed, like a donkey, is to place it within the forensic frame and give it the benefit that it's also an object or an entity worthy of ethical legal consideration. So that's why forensics and ecology, I tie it together because, interestingly, forensic ecology is actually an established field in forensics. It's a subdiscipline, and it looks at ecological aspects of a crime scene that will only shed light on human remains. So there is entomology there, where they will look at the life cycle of an insect like maggots that have invested themselves in a corpse and try and determine how long it's taken for that to develop, that pupae to develop, and thus determine how long that corpse has been dead in that particular field. So forensic ecology only looks at human remains, but uses aspects of an ecology like soil samples, seed samples, insects, etc., to resolve human crimes. So I sort of flipped that on its head and said, well, let's expand it so it actually encompasses all those entities which are only utilised in an instrumentalised way by forensic ecologists, so that they actually become actors, but also expert testimonial witnesses, but also victims of crimes themselves.
I think you talk about the forensic disavowal, isn't it? There's a sort of a slight, the forensic scientist indulging in a sort of sleight of hand. So it's actually relying on the object to speak whilst denying that voice, other than through the expert interpretation of the forensic scientist. So I suppose the argument that leads us on to, I think, an interesting point when you talk about indigenous cosmologies, etc. I think one of the ways in which the book achieves its aim is through its embrace of lots of non-Western ideas about the world, non-Western ontologies, non-Western epistemologies, and that it's key to the work the book does. So could you perhaps talk to that a little? Because I felt again that was when I was first reading it and you started drawing on research to talk about the situation in the occupied territories, for example, so indigenous scholarship from Australia or from North America. The first thing I felt at the time was, okay, why is he doing this? Yeah. The more I read, the more I realized without doing that, you cannot do what you're doing. So could you sort of talk to that a bit? Because I felt that was both necessary and intriguing.
Sure. So when I was looking at how to think through the more than human and in ethical legal ways, I read across the whole gamut of literature from, say, Derrida and Heidegger, all the sort of canonical figures, but also all the new recent formations, such as the new materialisms, which basically says that all entities, rocks, Hills, etc., have got agencies. You know, Bruno Latour's actor network theory. You know, the new ethology, new animal studies, which are, you know, claiming ethical considerability for animals, etc. So there were bits and pieces all over the place where this sort of knowledge, which was useful to try to challenge the denial of ethical and legal considerability to more than human subjects, it was available, but it was sort of fragmented. But then I thought, well, hang on a minute, you know, this is not working in a unified manner. But plus, once I began to read Indigenous cosmopolitics in depth, both Native American, South American, and Australian, what I began to see was that they had already done the work over millennia, that they had complex and challenging ways to think the legal aspect of the more than human, which absolutely overturned really the delimited and paternalistic ways in which the West imposes, say, an animal rights framework. Because rather than imposing rights on a more than human subject, what I found was that Indigenous cosmo-epistemologies were basically saying every entity has got its own law. They are the source of law, and as human subjects, we enter into treaties, negotiations, and ethical relations because we are bound in a system of relationality with the more than human. So what I do in the book then is I try and say, well, this is really interesting. All of this body of knowledge is out there, of course, as Indigenous people know, and it's been completely marginalised. It's never cited in something like the new materialisms, for example. And, you know, I quote some of the Indigenous scholars who actually call these new Western disciplines to account for saying, well, actually, this is neo-colonial. You're erasing knowledges that are already pre-existent and you're replicating them as though they never happened. So it's another form of terra nullius erasure, effectively. So I found the Indigenous cosmo-epistemologies so important because they not only challenge, they overturn Western assumptions about what constitutes law, what constitutes ethics, and they unified them in a relational way so that it accounts for everything, not just one being. Here's a dose of animal rights to you, the animal, the non-human animal, right? The rest can go to buggery, effectively. Trees, waters, mountains, soil.
So just Joseph, just for a second. Natalie, would you like to ask a question or would you like me to read it for you? That sounds very practical, but I just wanted to ask. Sorry, I don't mean to patronise you.
Thank you. No, not at all, not at all. Joseph, I was just hoping, I heard you're using more than human more than you're using non-human. So yeah. Could you kind of describe all the differences and then maybe also describe how we can get out of this duality between human and other without using these words? Like, how are we going to know what we're talking about if we're not talking like this?
Sure. Thanks, Natalie. I think that's a really important question, and I try to address that in the introduction. And I did think about it carefully because the options were the non-human, and I sort of refused to go down the path of the non-human because it's got this negative differential, and implicit in it is this hierarchy, right? Because you're defining something by what it is not. And I found that that's a really destructive way to go down, precisely because it posits this deficit framework where you are your own entity, but in this case, you're reduced to something lesser than because you don't have what it is that humans have. And it's also fallacious. I mean, when you look at, say, for example, the Indigenous, you know, some Indigenous cosmologies on this, they don't say that animals don't have language, that they don't have effect. They've got law, language, effect, treaty, everything. So there isn't this deficit framework. So I think there's a trap with the non-human reproducing that hierarchical deficit framework. And so it was difficult, but more than human, I clung on to because it sort of exceeds the categorical frames of even my own theorizing, right? There's something excessive to the more than human that exceeds anthropocentric frames. And I actually say, you know, I use that, but I can't make any categorical claims that I've nailed it because the other is already other to what I'm saying here. So there's an ethical impulse in trying to hold on to that issue of the more than human as a way of trying to get out of that impasse, but it's also a way of capturing that system of relationality, which I think is really important.
Thank you.
Oh, okay. So where were we? Now, Shirley, would you want to leave that as a comment, or would you like to ask it as a question?
Oh yes. I think it's just a very brief comment. I think what Joseph just mentioned, just struck me really quite strong, because the Chinese Taoists really share the same kind of idea, because they take nature as the best way. Everything is spontaneous, and so including animals, and just everything is part of the nature, and we are really interdependent, and we have a more holistic view of the cosmos, basically. So yeah, just a very brief comment, and I look forward to reading the book as well.
Oh, thank you, Shirley. And Shirley, I guess what is concerning when I looked at international law as a way and try to capture these crimes against the more than human in all of their multiplicity, what was clear to me is that precisely something like Taoist philosophy of life, an eco-philosophy of life, in which, as you say, everything is interrelated, they're cut out of the frame, because international law is still heavily weighted and freighted by Eurocentric forms of law.
That's right.
So the only way in which the more than human is captured, say, in international environmental law or international environmental law and war, is to categorize the more than human as property, literally. It's the destruction of property, not the destruction of living entities or entities that are crucial to their own survival and the planet's survival, but purely as property.
That's right. Yes, I agree with you. And also, as you say, it's very hierarchical sort of perspective as well. Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, I think.
Yes, thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, Shirley. Excuse me. Yes, I think you'll find. I mean, I think it's Val Plumwood talks about the hyper separation of culture and nature, and the fact that it's actually historically very unusual. If you look at the great scheme of the great span of human existence, this insistence on the duality of culture and nature is actually quite an unusual thing. Even though it's become completely naturalized in many ways, it is actually not historically that prevalent amongst many, many different cultures. And of course, as Joseph and Shirley have said, many, many cultures still refuse to make that distinction and sometimes suffer from it. I think Val Plumwood also said one of the reasons that European colonialism was so successful was because unlike local people, invaders were willing to trash the environment in a way local people wouldn't. So the ecocide was a method of colonialism, and not just a byproduct, but a way by which colonial power was maintained. And I think Joseph writes in the book, the only way to make a settler ecology is out of the indigenous ecology that's already there. You can't just swap one for another. One has to be destroyed in order that its parts can then be repurposed. So yeah, certainly. I suppose, what's the time? Okay, past. Well, that went quick. Okay, Joseph, you talk about bringing the biopolitical to the more and other than human. We'll accept those terms for a while. So that allows you in the book, I think, to talk about a biopolitics of water, about biopolitics of soil, a biopolitics of plants, a biopolitics of air, and of course, biopolitics of animals. And would you like to talk to that idea? Because I think that opens up the possibility for thinking in quite different ways.
Yeah. Well, when I began to, there'd been quite a body of work on biopolitics in the context, say, of Gaza and what was happening with the Israeli Defense Forces there, and the turning of Gaza into an open prison. So there's Joseph Pugliese, The Right to Maim book, which takes a biopolitical lens, but focuses, largely on issues of ability, disability, and human. But when I was watching Operation Protective Edge unfold and reading the testimonies, both Palestinian testimonies, and let me say, they were corroborated by the testimonies of Israeli Defense Forces who, in a particularly powerful book called This Is How We Fought, attested to their systematic destruction of the more than human world in Gaza. When I was looking at that, I thought, well, look, yes, this is biopolitics at work. It's the elimination of one form of life, Palestinian life in its globality, right? So that another form of life can flourish, Israeli life. But it's not capturing at all the destruction of all of those multiple entities, bees, water, soil, etc., that are being impacted on by military campaigns. And so what I decided to do was, I mean, I researched, and there really weren't the terminologies that, for me, enabled the articulation and the visualization of these multiple entities as also targets and victims of biopolitical modalities of violence. So I said, what the heck, let's invent the terms. So, you know, pedon politics refers to a biopolitics of the soil, aquapolitics, a biopolitics of water, phytopolitics, a biopolitics of vegetal life, etc. And I guess why I took those, you know, Greek etymologies was so it would be congruent with the whole notion of the bios that Foucault uses. And so, if you like, what I did was fracture or refract the singular biopolitical lens and make it multivalent, multispectral, so it would capture all of these entities through these named subsidiary modalities, because what I say is they work within nested formation under the superordinate category of the biopolitical. I mean, that's the drive. Either someone is going to be allowed to let die, as Foucault would say, so another can flourish, or they can be eliminated entirely. So what I say is these interrelated modalities of the biopolitics of the more than human work to do accumulative, accretive acts of violence and destruction through, if you like, a global ecocide. And the point I try to make is, because I don't just look at the occupied territories, I look at the drone killing fields of Somalia, Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan and Pakistan. They are sites of, you know, biopolitical elimination of the human and more than human that are actually exacerbating issues of global environmental change, etc. And I try and place military destruction within this larger anthropocenic, you know, global climate change disaster that's unfolding.
Yeah, and I suppose that's the point across all the sites that you look at, that these things happen. These ideas that can be applied can be seen to work together, to work in exacerbating each other. And what I got was the sense of what we're talking about with some of these is a combination of both, for want of a better word, fast and slow violence.
Yeah.
So there's the initial, the military incursion, the actual initial killing, but then there's the long-term poisoning of the soil or lead paint on a building that is then inhaled. So you then have higher rates of various respiratory diseases, which then lead to endocrinological problems in children who are then inhibited in their progress through school, that they sort of combine. So it's never, so they all sort of work, even though you highlight them individually, they never sort of work as individual phenomena.
Exactly.
And that was just really significant. Now, Corsa.
Yes, they interlock.
They interlock. Sorry, you say that that's a comment. So would you just like that to stand? You don't want me to comment on it, on your comment, Takalali?
I'd rather not speak to it. You can. Or
okay, no.
I'll pop it there.
Let's put it there. Good. You're never quite certain, but thank you. I should have just read the not a question and just did what I was told to do. So I'm sorry. Yes. So I suppose I could argue why you chose the particular sites you chose, because probably sadly there are a lot of places in the world where we can see this being played out. We talked a bit about Gaza and the occupied territories. Perhaps in looking at the second zone, we haven't talked about Guantanamo. Why? Because in some ways you've gone from a much larger sphere of conflict, and then you've come down to something very much more localized. Yeah. So how do these ideas help us understand what happens in Guantanamo?
Yeah, I guess the guiding thread that connects all of those disparate sites is the fact that you've got the US military, which is unacknowledged really as the most entrenched global polluter in the world. It's the most toxic industry that we have. And there was one statistic I saw where it said it basically accounts for 30% of carbon emissions. Now, when we hear about the global warming debates and global climate change, no one mentions the military, except for a few scholars. And so my interest was to say, how is this toxic, I cite one scholar who talks about toxic militarism. How does this toxic militarism play out across disparate sites? And what are the degrees at which it plays out? And in Guantanamo, I opened the book basically cataloguing the levels of toxicity that the US military has seeped into the very soil of Guantanamo, all the carcinogens that are leaching into that site, and then connect it to the other forms of toxicity, and that is the instrumentalized torture that that the US military has used against its Muslim detainees in Guantanamo. And again, the guiding thread is that, as I say in that chapter, there's a zoopolitics happening there, precisely because I track the way in which so many of the torture practices deployed against the detainees in Guantanamo, such as learned helplessness, where some of the detainees would basically be installed in these rooms, tortured, and whatever move they make, they would get an electric shock so that they would fear ever moving. And so there was this learned sense of helplessness where they would just whimper and be reduced for a piece of furniture. And I tracked the way in which that was developed in a US university lab on dogs, effectively. So I want to see the lines of exchange between, say, academia as a site of neutral, disinterested, so-called scientific practice, its performative violence on animals, and its transposition to sites of US imperialism and torture like Guantanamo.
Sure. And I suppose there's the parallel that you make with the way in which Gaza becomes the testing ground for various Israeli military projects.
Absolutely. So, I mean, people have talked about it being a laboratory because a lot of the Israeli defense merchants say, guess what? Buy our products. These have been successfully tested. And they're very proud of that. But, what I looked at is the way in which it's not only being tested on human populations. I mean, I talk about the pigs being slaughtered in those blasts, large sentient animals literally being put into a room with glass, and then you've got an explosion which shatters the glass and lacerates them, to pieces. And so for me, there's, to use Corsar's word there's an assemblage happening, an assemblage of the human and more than human in terms of its biopolitical expendability once you're categorized as lesser than.
Yeah, I thought that's actually one of those moments that stuck with me. I've got a list of all the things that I don't think I'll ever forget. And one of them is that whole phenomenon of pig school, where US Army medics are trained on using live pigs as human substitutes. And that over days, pigs get increasingly more horrendous injuries. So they start with a knife wound, and then you just go up through different types of wounding, higher caliber weapons, and in the end, you throw a grenade into a container, and then your job as the medic is to try and keep the animal alive for as long as you can. But of course, it doesn't matter how long you keep the animal alive for; they're going to be killed. They're going to be euthanized anyway. And I was thinking, that's one of those moments where I said, the ground where I sort of emotionally bottom out reading the book, because I thought, right, so, and every single medic. The US Army soldiers like being in a unit that has someone who's been to pig school, because not everybody gets it. So I thought, I cannot put that. I don't know. It's just one of those things, one of those moments of revelation that I got while reading this book. Now we've been going for 40 minutes. Does anyone do you want Joseph and I to stop so that you can ask?
We really want people to join the dialogue so that we're not two talking heads, so to speak.
Would that help or not? One of those moments. Stefan, great.
Hi. Thanks, Ian. Thanks, Joseph. It's wonderful to hear about your book, which I haven't read yet, but so fascinating and such obviously important work. I'm just interested. I'm teaching forensic architecture next week in my documentary unit.
Yeah.
And I wondered, as you were talking, I mean, maybe you already answered the question that I had, but with a group like Forensic Architecture, which touches on some of the things you've been talking about in terms of forensic ecology and the integration of matter and the more than human into their research, and other people like Susan Shupley, who does kind of, interested in matter, but always with I guess, motivated by crimes against the human, and with the end point being, what is the result of, taking into account the way that a building is destroyed, or what can we learn from a site. That always ends up with, the bottom line is, the war crime that's been committed, and who is responsible, which human actors are responsible, and who's been the victim in this situation. So I guess your research pushes beyond that in a really interesting way for me. And do you see that research as somehow perhaps limited in, or is that research that forensic architecture does limited by specifically the Western ontology that they approach their subject with?
Oh, thanks for that really important question. Yeah, look, I really admire the work that forensic architecture does. And as you know, I.L. Weisman has done incredibly foundational work in developing the inanimate as a forensic witness and testimony to crime. But there is this Eurocentric frame still operative there. And it's anthropocentric precisely because, as you say, it focuses only on the human as victim. And it's Eurocentric because, again, there is no sense of how Indigenous politics have already been there and will enable us to take into account the complex ecologies within which a piece of architecture is situated, and the knock-on effects of, as Ian was saying, once you blast a piece of architecture, the lead paint will go, the pulverization, as is happening in Gaza, and I talk about that in the book, the actual concrete dust goes into the air, goes into the water, is ingested through physiological processes. And it's ingested by birds, by fish, by waterways, up through the roots of trees. So it's a way of beginning to distribute the network of toxicity unleashed by a crime of violence, and to take into account, again, in a summary way, it's forensic ecology.
Thanks, Stefan. Chris.
Yeah, well, thanks first for really inspiring conversation, and I'm eagerly awaiting the book. It's in the post. I've been thinking all along, especially in this last discussion, to the parallels with the kind of work in nuclear anthropologies and ecologies, and I just wondered to what extent there is a dialogue or a certain point of connection there. I think, like Joseph Masco's work in New Mexico, tracking the kind of systematic destruction of US and indigenous cultures, a way of the state apparatus to create this machine of surveillance and policing its own population. So is there an extension to that project? Or
absolutely, Chris. And I cite Masco's work both in the state violence book, because I situate the US military complex, the industrial complex, in the massive expropriation of indigenous lands, and specifically the Western sheep-eater lands in Nevada, where all the nuclear testing has taken place, where all the new weapons testing continues to take place, and where the uranium waste dumping also occurs. And Masco and others like Tracy Boyles look at the whole wastelanding, say, of Nevada, New Mexico by the US military. And so I think, their work is absolutely crucial because it's situating that, military industrial complex within expropriated indigenous land and showing the knock-on effects of this military enterprise of toxicity within Indigenous communities and their ecologies. And, you know, we've got them in Australia too. I mean, at the end of the book, I talk about Maralinga, of course, and the way in which Maralinga is our exemplary, like Nevada site in terms of nuclear testing and the proposals for dumping there in South Australia too. So I'm absolutely in dialogue with that sort of work.
Do we have, oh, sorry, Iqbal, fire away.
Thanks, Joseph, for a magnificent work. And, you know, I'm just thinking about, you know, how are you framing your work in terms of the current situation, in terms of the pandemic? You know, I mean, I've just recently, after I finished your work, I read Benjamin Bratton's new book, Return of the Real. It's a very, very problematic work that is deeply, I mean, it's a work that is framed as a critique of what he calls negative biopower, and someone like Agamben becomes an easy straw man in this case because of his views of the pandemic. You know, and so I'm just thinking whether I'm just really fearing that move towards this new technophilia, which I think it's in current discourses, especially what we hear around how the Asian technocracies have successfully dealt with the virus, for example. So in a sense, I just wanted your projection into the current situation, basically. I want to hear that.
Yeah, sure. Well, you know, the last thing I would be technophiliac, because, you know, I'm part of that Soma Technics founding team, right? Where we see technics as instrumentally inscribed in everything that we do, including language at the most elementary. So I would disassociate myself from any sort of technophiliac. What I'd be interested in doing, and I do, look, the pandemic hadn't quite hit when I finished the book, but you know that I broached something that runs parallel to what happened with the pandemic, with the whole, you know, what I call a biopolitics of transboundary autoimmunity. I'm not sure if you remember that section. And I think that can be transposed to analysing the way in which there are no hard borders. I mean, Israel has got the Iron Dome. The Iron Dome fails to block the entry of Palestinian pathogens that have been created in toxic ecologies. They would cross borders, they have crossed borders, they've entered Israeli hospitals, they've infected Israeli citizens. So I guess that for me is an exemplary moment of the COVID crisis, where we see these borders established and then collapse, because there's a transboundary of autoimmunity operative here. So I don't see the solution as either border motivated or technology motivated or anti-technology motivated. I'm looking really for ways in which we can begin to understand how the enormous destruction we're doing on our ecologies are creating toxic effects. I can't categorically say where the COVID crisis came from, the virus came from, but we have got notions that there was transfer from more than human animals to humans that possibly constructed in a lab. They would be the sites for me to examine in terms of how we are instrumentalizing nature to our own self-destruction and the destruction of our more than human relations.
Thanks, Joseph.
Okay, 4:51, so we've still got time. Would anyone else like to ask a question? If not, perhaps I could ask. I'll ask. Oh, sorry, zoom in.
Hi, Joseph and Ian. That's been an absolutely riveting conversation so far. Joseph, there's so much that's disturbing here. I guess I'm just wondering whether you have solutions.
I don't have solutions as such, but I point to the way in which Indigenous nations have proposed solutions for millennia in terms of the lived practices of ethical relationality to the earth and all of its subjects. And so I, you know, in the introduction to the book, I actually say, Su-Ming, the West in this moment of crisis is now finally beginning to see that, you know, what we're doing is not sustainable because it's going to be the destruction of the planet. And Indigenous people have been saying from South America, North America, Australia, and other locations, this is how we can live and preserve life on this planet. And they've got an ethical platform that's embedded in law and that calls for the considerability of all life, including soil, water, trees, etc. So for me, there's a template there about how to move forward. But also the other area of hope, and I bring that up in the afterwards, Su-Ming, is ordinary people doing small practices on an everyday basis, which are challenging this really destructive, globally affecting framework that's now in train across so many different locations. And I name some of the practices, which for me, as I say, they fissure the hegemon that we're currently, Ian, you might want to talk to those sacrifice zones and people who are actually putting their lives on the line in terms of stopping, preventing, and trying to turn around these instances of ecocide.
Yes, I suppose it's almost in the vacuum that's left by, you know, the lack of governance, lack of law, lack of action, lack of willpower, that local people in different parts of the world are taking things into their own hands. And that can be every certain sort of non-violent protest, but right the way through to absolutely violent protests, looking at Indigenous nations in the Amazon, for example, effectively like declaring war on state governments and actually fighting, you know, the continued colonial war that has never really stopped. And I suppose the point is that I said I think there's something like four environmental defenders a week have been killed for the last 6 years, 4 people a week in the sacrifice zone, which straddles the equator. People are killed every week defending often forests in that particular zone. So they are examples of, and sometimes people die and we don't know who they are. We don't even know they made that. We don't even know that they were killed doing what they're doing. People's bodies are found in the forest. The context of that death. I suppose this is where I suppose your idea, Joseph, the forensic ecology of those scenes might reveal what happened there. And I think also in your afterword, I think it felt like an aftermath. An afterword was those simple acts of care. So we're talking about simply watering a plant. This was in Gaza, wasn't it? Because of the way in which the water supply is controlled by the Israeli state, water shortages, but people are still finding water to water plants, even though there's not really enough water for themselves. Or people caring about a wounded bird. You've just had your whole town destroyed, your house has been destroyed, your livelihood has been destroyed, and you find a wounded bird because the bird is a victim of that state violence. But you have it within yourself to care for that bird. And then in the testimony, the bird actually dies. But those moments of multi-species care, I suppose that's the idea, is that sometimes in the wake of, in the vacuum of real political change, then perhaps care is something that is within everybody's grasp. I can care. And in that moment of supreme loss, there was something about trying to help a more than human other, where supposedly good sense would tell you you've got better things to think about than whether that bird lives or dies. But the time to stop, and I think, yes, the aftermath in the afterwards of the book, you do list a lot of examples. Care for the eviscerated bodies of sheep that have been hit by drones. So people actually care because often you can't differentiate between the human remains and the remains of the more than human. So that the way in which the tenderness of the people who care for that flesh, that flesh of the world, Merleau-Ponty's idea. So I think there's those things. On the one hand, there are those large political changes, but there's also those everyday acts of care. And obviously the ultimate care with some of the forest defenders is to give up their own lives. But there are smaller acts of care that I think we're all capable of in a vacuum of large-scale political action.
Absolutely, and at the higher order level, we are seeing Indigenous cosmopolitics influencing nation-state laws within settler states like Aotearoa, New Zealand, where a mountain and a river, due to Indigenous Maori lobbying, have now been enshrined as persons within their own right that have the right to protection. So we're seeing the demolition of this Euro-anthropocentric framework bit by bit, and it's the fissures that count, because the fissures will cause the hegemon to fall, even if we're not around to see it. But I see all of those acts working at different calibrations as crucial. And, you know, like from the moment, you know, from that very minute moment that Ian talks about, and that is the care for the injured bird, to declaring a mountain an entity that has right to exist without being pillaged and plundered. These are acts of love. And I think love is absolutely crucial to giving us hope through care, through an ethical relation to the other. And, you know, what I try and challenge in the book is, I try and challenge the way forensics absolutely disavows any sense of affectivity in relation to its object of inquiry. And I invest all that affectivity that they disavow back, I reinsert it back into those circuits, because I want us to feel for the ones that are lost, for the ones that are killed, for the ones that are traumatized.
Yeah, it reminds me of that comment by, I think it's Michael Sula, who's a biologist, but also Deborah Bird-Rose as well, about we will save what we love.
Yeah.
So I think that's exactly what, and I think that is, perhaps that's something, as it's now 5 o'clock, it might be a hopeful position on which to end this discussion, perhaps.
Yeah, I think we might let everyone off. It's been a long semester.
So thank you, James. Thank you, everybody. And we'll see you all in person soon, hopefully.
Hopefully.
And thank you all for coming today.
Thank you, Ian, for hosting this, and thank you, Ty, for enabling it too. And thank you, everyone who took the time out of their own busy schedules to come to this discussion today. Thank you very much.
Okay. Bye for now.
Bye, everyone.
I'll add to the thank yous as well, and that great note that we ended on about saving that which we love. I'll just share my screen once more to kind of bookend a conversation that probably should not be bookended, because there are so many questions even popping up in the chat at the moment that I think we can continue to think about those ideas of learning and unlearning. I think there probably needs to be a lot more unlearning happening in universities as well. So I just wanted to note that we've got one last new book talk this year, this semester, and that's by our very own Swimming Teo. So we're really looking forward to that, which is coming up, and you'll get notice from that by email as well.